This is the Industrial and Natural Landscape session. We're going to be hearing from three speakers today. First, we'll hear from Mark Karpinski on the Utah Coal Company towns, rural towns created to fuel Western urbanization. And we'll hear from Susie Petheram, who will be speaking on the Jordan River, then and now, from rural resource to urban resource. And then finally from Jessica Montcalm, echoes from the camp, Sego as a case study in identifying an industrial landscape. And I had a flash there where I kind of felt like I was reading the nominees for the best documentary at the Oscars. But, so these are great. Okay. So we'll start with Mark Karpinski. Is a senior archaeologist, principal investigator with 17 years of experience completing cultural resources projects in Nevada, Utah, Colorado, Oregon, Wyoming, Idaho, Oklahoma, Texas, North Dakota, New York, and Pennsylvania. Projects include inventory, testing, mitigation, and monitoring for numerous development projects, as well as on behalf of private, state, and federal agencies. Mark has presented papers and posters at annual meetings for the Society of American Archaeology, the Plains Anthropological Society, Rocky Mountain Anthropological Society, Great Basin Anthropological Society, and the Geological Society of America. And we are looking forward to his presentation.
The dynamic relationship between urban and rural has played out throughout Utah history, especially in the urban's need for energy and the rural's need for capital. The recent oil and gas boom in Utah that revived old plays and brought roughnecks and drill rigs to rural portions of the state is one example of a long history that has played out over the entire history of both the state and the American West. Coal was critical to the development of the western United States as the economy during the late 19th and early 20th century was furnace and steam powered and required large amounts of reliable fuel source. The arid environment of the West made wood supplies small, slow growing, and sparsely distributed. Early settlers and homesteaders quickly exhausted wood supplies around towns and homesteads, creating a demand for residential coal. Additionally, heavy industry such as smelting and certain commercial agricultural sugar beets needed large amounts of coal as well to complete the process. The demand created a boom that impacted both urban and rural development in Utah specifically and the West generally. So the information on my current talk, which like most things archaeological is preliminary, as we're still analyzing artifacts and doing data together. But it's based on work we conducted between 2014 and 2016 on behalf of Pacific Corps as part of their carbon power plant closure. Tetra Tech conducted a Waters of the U.S. delineation and associated cultural resource inventory for a stormwater drainage system as part of the ash landfill closure. Within the footprint of the proposed drainage system was a previously recorded historic coal town known as Heiner. The town was originally recorded in 1987 and in 2001 was updated. At that time, it was made eligible for the National Register of Historic Places. The Army Corps of Engineers determined the sustainable water system would be an adverse effect on the portion of the site facing impact, and therefore SHPO concurred, and this required a treatment plan and mitigation of the adverse effect required before construction. Tetra Tech was the one who developed the treatment plan and conformed to standard archaeological practices and the intent to yield information that would support a research-specific research design. Methodology was approved by the Corps and SHPO in the fall of 2015. As part of this, we started with archival research that was compiled to find relevant primary data that would help with the field investigations. the cultural component that we are going to investigate. The impacted part, as you can see on the one picture, is on the blue box. I know this script is small, I'm sure for you guys it's bigger so you can see some more detail. It's right up against the actual ash landfill itself. Technically, you can see the larger picture. The red circle is sort of from that vantage point where our investigation focused. And yes, with the way the current ash landfill is, about half the site is underneath the landfill. So, which has never been formally documented anyway. So a few places felt the need for coal more acutely in Utah, where winter historically was reported to bring coal famines and also limited economic development since settlement in 1849. In 1854, the territorial legislature and LDS hierarchy worked to promote the coal industry within the state with a $1,000 award for the development of an economical coal source. Early attempts in Sanpete County near Moroni, Utah, and near Colville in Summit County proved unsuccessful due to long transportation distances and the low quality of coal. The completion of the Transcontinental Railroad in 1869 brought hope to the Wasatch Front that coal would finally arrive in abundance. By 1870, the Union Pacific was shipping coal to the Wasatch Front from its line in southwestern Wyoming and the recently acquired Wasatch Coal Company at Colville. However, the Union Pacific Railroad monopoly caused discontent as competing coal operators were charged lower shipping rates, and while the UP shipped 93 tons of coal to Salt Lake City in 1873, they were significantly insufficient for the demand. Residents of the Wasatch Front accused the Union Pacific of deliberately shorting supplies to maintain high prices. Tensions renewed the search for coal, especially coking coal needed to develop the smelters, ironworks, and steel mills that were needed to support the hard rock mining in places like Kennecott and throughout the western half of the state. By 1875, mining operations began in Huntington Canyon, followed 4 years later by the Winter Quarters mine in Pleasant Valley. However, these mines still relied on wagon and mules to transport the coal market, which limited production and the market that could be served. A significant coal discovery from the eastern side of the Wasatch Plateau stated an estimated reserve of 88 billion tons of bituminous coal with excellent coking qualities existed. The report reached the ears of Eastern Railroad barons, and surveyors, engineers, financiers descended on one of the most lightly settled regions of Utah to confirm the reports and lay claims. The coal discovery prompted the Denver Rio Grande to push west through these new coal fields to connect with Ogden instead of heading south as they originally felt they were going to do towards El Paso and the Mexican mining regions. The completion of the line linked the newly discovered coal fields to the Wasatch Front, creating immediate convergence for regional abundance of high-quality coal and rail transportation. In 1909, federal antitrust suits finally broke the railroad monopoly on coal lands, and smaller non-railroad corporate entities were able to develop more mines in carbon memory counties to meet the demands for the rapidly industrializing Wasatch Front and western United States. In 1909, Franklin Cameron, then a supervisor with Utah Railroad at Castlegate, broke from the company and was purchased 2 ranches totaling approximately 350 acres of land on the north side of Price Canyon, southeast of the town of Castlegate, Utah. The Panther mine was primarily designed to serve the residential coal demands of Salt Lake City and western Utah, and it was named Panther for the adjacent canyon. The town was renamed Carter in 1913, reportedly due to the United States Post Office prohibiting the use of town names or animals. The workforce varied between 30 and 6 men during initial development. In 1912, 20 miners were reported to have produced 4 carloads of coal per week, and that same year, Cameron sold the Panther and States company in town to W.G. Sharp's Consolidated Fuel Company. By 1915, the recently incorporated United States Fuel Company owned the mine and the town. They leased the mine, actually, then right back to Cameron, and the superintendent, John Crawford, continued to run the mine until 1918. The town changed names the third time in 1918 to Heiner, after Moroni Heiner, the vice president of the company. By the 1920s, the town had electricity, culinary water, a company store, a 4-room schoolhouse, and the United States Post Office. In the early 1930s, the United States Fuel Company leased the mine to Frank Haynes, who reported to have continued operations with only 8 men and worked the mine until it was closed in 1937. Sources differ as to the reason for the closure of the mine and the abandonment of the town. While the timing was always consistent in every report, reasons range from the coal seam being exhausted to the coal quality degrading to the market conditions at the time, making it uneconomical. The town reported to have been abandoned by the United States Fuel Company, and the building was dismantled and sold off by early 1938. The United States Fuel Company was a subsidiary of the the Salt Lake-based United States Smelting, Refining, and Mining Company. The company also owned and operated coal mines in associated towns of Hiawatha, Black Hawk, and Moreland in Emery County, Utah. Comparatively, Panther Mine was small in both annual tonnage produced and number of miners employed. In 1915, the Utah State Mine Inspector report listed Panther Mine as producing 44,571 short tons, compared to Hiawatha, which produced 222,228 short tons, with both Black Hawk and Moreland producing similar large amounts. The company itself claimed that their company towns were known to be in mining circles for their excellence. The government assessment of miners' welfare in the 1920s focused on the United States Fuel Company's town of Hiawatha. Their assessment found the town to be well planned, of high construction quality, and having a modern hospital, 2 churches, and provided numerous amusements, including a bowling alley, a pool hall, and movie theater. And the profits of those amusements were invested back in the town. The company even built and operated a modern dairy to supply the company towns of Hiawatha, Moreland, and West Hiawatha with milk, butter, and ice cream. No evidence whether Heiner got any of that stuff, but we missed out, I guess. Heiner had no similar amusement establishments, hospitals, churches, or similar facilities. Heiner's comparative small size and close proximity to the town of Helper, Utah, likely made the United States Fuel Company decide that such facilities were unnecessary. So, throughout the project, we were conducting research for both primary and secondary sources, including but not limited to such things as maps, plans, schematics, photographs, census records, newspapers, and other academic studies and journals. We have in the lower left-hand corner view is a brief list of some of the archives that were checked as part of this project. The results of the archive research provided important information regarding Heiner's demographics and history. The census data places the town population at 138 in 1920 and 316 individuals in 1930. Heiner's population included Euro-Americans, Italians, Greeks, Austrians, Yugoslavs, Japanese, and Czechoslovakian immigrants. Based on the census data, the majority of Heiner residents were U.S.-born citizens, and most of them had been born and lived in Utah. The census data also shows that Heiner's population was incredibly diverse, with up to 11 different countries and of origin, and potentially 6 different languages being spoken on a given day. And yet the foreign-born and immigrants never exceeded 20% of any single population or census account. And this was intentional, as eventual mine inspector in 1950 and eventual superintendent of this mine, J.R. Pettit, has stated that the companies practice intentional hiring to maintain the immigrant populations at a certain level and a certain diversity to obviously prevent the communities forming and keep the workforce sort of divided. In 1929 company pamphlet listed wages for an 8-hour day at $7 for common labor and between $8 and $16 a day for miners, depending on mine tonnage. Steady employment was said to bring between $200 and $400 a month. Non-mining professionals listed in the census included teachers, a nurse, a shoemaker, a printer, a farmer, an electrician, and a peace officer. The nurse was the daughter of one of the company miners and staffed the sort of, I guess you'd call it, to today's parlance, an urgent care center that would occasionally have company doctors will come through for both regular calls and emergencies. Heiner, one thing that's been brought up with a lot of mine camp studies is, unlike hard rock mining, coal miners, when they were hired on, were lamented by the company superintendents to bring 5 or more people with them, as coal miners tended to see themselves more as skilled tradesmen and tended also to have very large families. Heiner was no exception. There was a diet in the bottom. It's just one example of some of the demographic data showing the profusion of children in the town that occurred between 1920 and 1930. This, changed from single teacher, also in 1920 and 1930, from single teacher to 4 teachers, a 4-room schoolhouse, and so it's just a showing of the infrastructure that had to go along with these towns so to maintain a workforce. The 1930 census also records rent in the town, which ranged between $6 and $25 a month. Most were between $8 and $11 a month. Based on the records, the rents do not appear to correlate to the individual, their ethnicity, their family size, or their position in the company. The only rent that appears to correlate to company positions to mine superintendents at $25 a month. The rest of the rent variance seems to be based solely on the building and its likely amenities and size. In the 1930 census, 4 families are reported to actually own their homes, which is an interesting development. But we don't know, they may have owned the homes, we don't know if they own the land. That was a common alternative with these company towns. But as people own their homes, one was a non-mine employee of a farmer, the other was a non-mine employee of a shoemaker, and 2 were miners. Between January and March 2016, Tetra Tech conducted archaeological field work within portions of the site facing impact. Field work was conducted using standard archaeological theory and practice. Spatial controls were handled using a centimeter-accurate temporal unit. Investigation and analysis of the archaeological material is ongoing. And the following is a brief summary of our findings. The recovered cultural component reflects residential use and/or activities related to dismantling of the town. Much of the recovered material is located immediately outside the examined foundations, suggesting of disposal during building and dismantling. Based on the temporal and contextual information, the cultural component and material is a reflection of pioneer from at least 1933 to 1938. Overall, approximately 3,000 artifacts were recovered, relating to everything from actual mining tools, domestic life, and personal consumer goods. The consumer goods were largely, for lack of a better term, generic and widely available for purchase across the West during this period. While the town had numerous European immigrants, such as Italians and Greeks, no definitive cultural material was encountered reflecting these groups. For example, the excavation of one dump found material that we could associate with the Italian shoemaker listed on the 1930 census as Charles Carmani, yielded no evidence that he and his wife's Italian heritage or background. Yet Asian porcelain was recovered from the site and is theorized to be associated. The porcelain included such things as rice bowls and similar material associated with the Japanese Aoki family that is also reported on the 1930 census. The recovered material opens interesting questions regarding Americanization of immigrants and the need for and how immigrants live their lives ethnically in between both public and private life. Faunal evidence, our table there, just one of the various tables, is reflective of medium to lower cost cuts prepared for roasting, usually prepared by roasting and stewing. The meat, based on the cuts, the meat was definitely raised and slaughtered outside of town, and what was showing up in the record were secondary and tertiary butchering cuts. The elements identified show species that were common to the region, mostly sheep and cow, with some chicken and some turkey, that were raised by the local agricultural industry. Once again, nothing definitively calling out any one group. Due to the realities of the coal industry, by the early 1900s, the U.S. coal industry housed between 70 and 80% of its workforce in company-owned housing. Coal companies also tended to practice the era's version of corporate paternalism that, among other things, resulted in company housing being planned communities that provided an array of services instead of what some people would more characterize as very utilitarian man camps. As such, a town such as the United States Fuel Company invested very much in the Heiner, though the amenities were scaled to the size of the mine in the town, and as such the town had a more urban feel or lifestyle than would be suggested by its setting. The town had culinary water and electricity, and at least one resident in Heiner had radiating heat, though the residents appeared to have never had internal plumbing. For its size, Heiner was incredibly demographically diverse, and when the town was shut down, many residents would remain in the region impacting rural demography for years to come. The historical documents and recovered artifact assemblage reflect an urban consumer lifestyle compared to non-mining towns in the area. Residents did not engage in tasks associated with the need for self-reliance, as has been typically associated with rural living. The primary task was obviously to be mining coal. The company towns were not isolated communities either. Residents freely moved throughout the region via the newly developed infrastructure and numerous rail spurs and roads that would be built in the region. Another thing that I didn't add in here is a lot of pictures of closing on the town of Heiner itself. A lot of the miners appear also to own automobiles, at least by the late 20s, early 30s. The Utah coal company towns in the early 1900s had similar impacts we see throughout Utah history into the present day, when extractive industries arrived into rural areas during natural resource booms. In addition to infrastructure development and growth of pricey Heiner, the coal boom of the early 20th century also revived Castle Valley agriculture. Former immigrant miners, many of whom were blacklisted from the strikes in 1901 and 1903, bought land and sold produce directly to the town residents. The Great Depression is ultimately busted the Utah coal boom, with many mines in their towns closing and going bankrupt. The population decreased and capital stopped flowing into the region. Like many areas of the Western U.S. that suffered economic downturns after a development boom, a rapidly urbanized area became rural again. Within while the industry would recover, it would return fundamentally different. Market conditions, technological development would significantly lower the size of the needed workforce and render company towns obsolete. However, the study of the early 20th century coal towns provides great insight into Utah's history of the dynamic relationships between urban and rural. Questions pursued in this paper and project research design will continue to develop as the analysis of the recovered material and the archival searches are actually brought together even more than we've gotten to so far. And we'll be further producing a comprehensive site technical report as well as further peer-reviewed articles and some more material. And so I'd like to acknowledge as part of this project is obviously Pacificor and Rocky Mountain Power for their support during the permitting process and for funding all of our research. I'd also like to thank the United States Army Corps of Engineers, Sacramento District, and the Utah Division of State History for their input on both the research design and archaeology and the work we do to this date. So thank you.
Thank you, Mark. I neglected to mention that we'll save comments and questions until after all three presentations. I think we're running more or less on time, and so we should have some time before the end of the conference to ask questions. We'll next be hearing from Susie Petheram, who is an urban planner and historic preservationist, and associate principal with CRSA, the planning and architecture firm in Salt Lake City. She's currently finishing her PhD in metropolitan planning, policy, and design at the University of Utah, where she is studying the impacts of the light rail system on the value of surrounding neighborhoods in Salt Lake County. She lives in the Sugar House neighborhood and is very active in the community with her husband and two children. And today she'll be talking about the results of some research into the Jordan River.
Thanks for coming out this afternoon. As Nelson mentioned, I work at CRSA, and I put together this presentation based on some work that we are doing for forestry, fire, and state lands. We're working with SWCA to help them with the Jordan River Comprehensive Management Plan, and as part of that process, I was doing some research on the history and came across a lot of great old photos and information, and kind of being the history nerd that I am, I was like, oh, this would be great to do sort of a presentation for the State History Conference and try to get some current day photos to match up to some of those historic ones. But during the process of doing that CMP and doing the public outreach, talking to the people and finding out what their concerns were, also led me to realize that, historically it was this rural resource, but today it's this urban resource, and a lot of the concerns and issues and relationships that people have with the river are related to it as an urban resource. So just going to go through some background and information. I'm by no means an expert, so there might even be some of you in here that know a little bit more about the river than me, and I would love to hear your comments later. So I love this image of Salt Lake City looking to the north. It was done in 1891. And it's this very idealized image of both the city, but also the Great Salt Lake and the Jordan River. If you look at it, it's just like very blue and sparkling, and I think by this time the river was probably already fairly exploited, and it's a very highly managed system. It was then, and it is today, both for rural resources, but also for flood control, diversions, and so it maintains a very highly managed system. But I like that this image kind of still portrays it as this natural meandering river, which it still is in many parts, follows its natural meander, but in many parts it's been channelized for a variety of reasons. So the Jordan River, at the platting of Salt Lake, it functioned as that western boundary of Salt Lake City, and the early platting system stayed to the east of the river. It's maybe not super clear on this image, but almost all the plats, except for Plat C in Salt Lake City, occurred to the east of the Jordan River. And even though we had some farming plats down with the 5-acre plat A, B, and C, and 10-acre plats south of that, people still gravitated towards the Jordan River for agricultural purposes. One of the reasons is that the soil was a little bit better there in the surrounding valley, and people, might have moved here, and they, even though Salt Lake was not very dense, there was still a lot of people there. And if people wanted a little bit more space, they moved out. They went over Jordan to the west side and started settling there and building farms and homesteads out there. To do that, they started constructing diversions and canals and ditches off of the river, utilizing it for irrigation purposes. And so from a rural perspective, the resource was the water itself to irrigate those crops. It was very utilitarian in nature. It wasn't necessarily seen as a recreational benefit to live near the river, but it was a very practical means of getting the water. This is a great image of the different creeks that flow into the river from the surrounding watershed, and then also the diversions and major canals that branch off of the Jordan River. It flows through 3 counties, Utah County, Salt Lake County, and Davis County, and goes through 15 different municipalities, and each one kind of has, over time, used the river in a different manner. But I think if you totaled the length of the canals and diversions off of the river itself, they would probably be 5 or 6 times the length of the river itself. And so it's much more than just the Jordan River as a resource. The farming was one of those early benefits of being near the river. I think the farms tended to be larger, and looking at some stats, farming was still very prevalent in Salt Lake County up through 1950. When they did the census for the agricultural, the acres that were still in farming production within Salt Lake County in 1950 were about 490,000 acres. By 2012, that had dwindled to just 16% of that amount, just under 80,000 acres. And most of that acreage that's in farmland is 10-acre lots or less. And so it's gone from being those large farms on the west side of the river to these smaller farms that are still, active in production, but much lower in scale. This is a great image that is available on the Jordan River Commission's website. If you go to it, it links to an interactive web map that shows the different channels and meanderings of the river over time. This is something that the state updates this and tries to keep track of how the river has changed over time. The reason being that Forestry, Fire, and State Lands has ownership and management of the bed of the river itself. So where the river flows, their management flows. And that's one of the reasons that they're in that process of adopting a comprehensive management plan, so that if something goes over or under the river, then it's a process that needs to go through Forestry, Fire, and State Lands to get permission and get leasing permits for where they want to put it. And the idea of the plan is to try to manage it from more of best management practices instead of just letting anything go in anywhere, looking at where the river has already been developed with either a bridge or a utility pipeline, and try to concentrate those areas so that the other areas can remain more of a natural resource. So this is just a great map, and I think if you see some of the later channels in the blue and the green, a lot of those historic natural meanders have been straightened out. So it's a really interesting map to check out. So sort of in between it being a rural resource for agricultural uses and to where it is today, there's this period of time where really the river itself was just kind of used as a dumping ground of sorts, and it wasn't really considered a resource. It was more, we were degrading the river, and it was damage control. The river was seen as a problem. So the degradation, most of that is runoff. Before it was agricultural runoff, but as Salt Lake City started to get bigger and bigger, of course with that comes issues with sewer, and a lot of the early ditches, were just open ditches, but most of the runoff kind of flowed west, flowed out to the Jordan, right into the river. So it was a very polluted river. It was not that ideal blue river that you saw in the earlier color image. And this is just an early map of the sewer system from the early 20th century, and it wasn't until 1909 that Salt Lake City started looking at actually putting in a sewer system. So before that, it was either individual septic tanks or these open canals or ditches that drained the sewage from the households. A lot of it was dependent on gravity, but if you go through the history, you follow the pipes and they go out to the Jordan River to a little open pipe and just dump everything out to the river. So looking at some of the Sanborn maps and doing some research for the Vernacular Architecture Forum tour that's coming in May of 2017, looking at the Central 9th neighborhood, 9th South and 2nd West. And on the Sanborn maps, you see, this blue line and it says canal. And you think, oh, canal, irrigation canals. Nope, it was basically a sewage ditch. And so, that's just related to the popularity of that neighborhood being appealing to residents. They're platting it, they're subdividing it, but really until they started to enclose that ditch and put it underground, there were some limited benefits to living that close to an open ditch, which you see on the right. Just very muddy, just open water flowing through, and that's how the water was flowed west out to the Jordan. In this image you see, this is right before they started putting in the sewer system. There's some great infrastructure photos from the city engineers collection. Again, if you're kind of a historic image geek like I am, just looking through those are really interesting to see, the process of building the infrastructure that we kind of take for granted today. So this is 9th South going to the west. I mentioned that the Forestry and Fire and State Lands manages things that go under or over the river. This was an early photo of just siphons that they were burying underneath the river for drainage purposes, trying to manage flood control not just from the Jordan itself, but from the surrounding tributaries. The image on the left is from 1952, just the river itself is really swelling. The image on the right, 1983, the big flood. See how the water is very close up to the bottom of the bridge. The Jordan was actually used to help drain some of that mountain streams that were overflowing. The pictures of State Street being sandbagged and just trying to shovel everything out to the Jordan River into Salt Lake. I didn't live here in 1983, we moved here in the late 90s, but still hear stories for people that lived here and just the major event that it was and how it led to new regulations and agreements between Utah County and Salt Lake County because of the way the Jordan River was managed and affecting both Salt Lake County, but also the flooding of Utah Lake and the residents that lived near the lake. So today, the Jordan River over time has come to be known more as an urban resource. And some of the benefits that we use today at Jordan River Parkway actually started out of those previous control issues. The flood control was one of the main reasons that led to the creation of the Jordan River Parkway in the early 70s. But now, it's something that people value, and as we went out to the public during the comprehensive management plan process, the majority of comments that we heard about people's interests and concerns and relationships with the river was about recreation and boating access and ensuring that trailheads were properly marked and signed. The second issue was the native vegetation and invasive species that have taken over. The phragmites are a large issue for most municipalities and places up and down the river. But that was the primary concern that we saw. You still got a few people that were concerned about the water rights and wanted to make sure that that was not going to be impacted because they had those water rights in their family for generations, sometimes going back to the 1850s. We heard from a couple of families that had been on the west side of the Jordan River for that long and still maintain their water rights to some of the canals in the river. The resources, not just on the river itself, but also adjacent to it. I think the types of uses of the river, the boating, the kayaking, there's plans by the Jordan River Commission to help fund grants to construct new, more formalized boat ramps to make it safer for people to get on and use the river. And so there's a lot of activism out there generating interest in just sort of capitalizing on the river for more of a thing of beauty and ecological and cultural benefit. But also the canals that go off of the river are also a resource. So historically, those were a real resource for the agricultural irrigation. But now, those canals are seen as opportunities for trails. But also the surplus canal, which was a major flood control issue, is used by 2 different crew clubs. Rowing crew is not something that you typically associate with the West and mountain states, but that surplus canal is used by the Waterford School for a crew team and the Utah Crew Club. And so they have these regattas up and down the river, and those images are very athletic and I must have forgotten. The trail itself next to the river is just a great resource for families and people to get out, be in nature. Nelson has said this too. It's just 4 blocks from the parkway, and they use it all the time. And so it's great. Not everybody has the opportunity to get up into the mountains and go for a hike in the canyons. But if you live fairly close to the river, you can just get over, go for a walk with your dogs, ride the bike with your family. Also in the winter, just getting out to snowshoe or ski, you have that opportunity because of the cooperative nature of developing that parkway along the river. A related issue, are the creeks and tributaries that flow into the Jordan River. These images are from the Three Confluence Park at, I think it's 1300 South, where 3 different creeks flow into the river. Red Butte, Emigration, and like the last one, and I probably have my notes, but I don't think it's part of this, it could be part of this. But basically, if you see on the image on the left and the top right, these creeks in the early 20th century were all piped and put underground. Most of the urban creek length is under the streets, under the infrastructure. It's in pipes, and it has this very, sort of dismissive nature of entering the Jordan River in these concrete culverts. The Seven Canyons Trust is an organization that is working to do some daylighting of some of these urban creeks. They've done some great outreach. Have the image on the bottom right. This would be a good place for a creek because that's essentially where the creek is flowing underneath that parking lot. Trying to do some activism and renderings and proposals for parks utilizing some of the space that's adjacent to the river and make it even more of a benefit for people to use and enjoy as a resource. So to conclude, I just wanted to go through a few photos from the State Histories collection and some of the ones that we came across in our research for the Comprehensive Management Plan. And then we tried to match them up fairly closely with images from Google Street View or images that I found on some of the city's websites. So the photos on this page are the Glendale subdivision. Just an aerial view. If you look at the left, 1937, so still when Salt Lake County was still fairly agricultural in nature on the west side of the river. By 1952, on the right, you start to see how subdivision and veteran communities started to impact the land uses surrounding the river. This is an image of the district that is about 800 south and 900 west, next to the river. Just impacted by the regular floodings of the river before it was controlled with a lot of the dredging and the surplus canal. So people might have become stranded in their homes or just needed to utilize those to access their homes on a fairly regular basis because of the way the river functioned. Today, it's still a very residential neighborhood, but with the infrastructure in place, it's less impacted by the river, and they can utilize it as a resource instead of feeling negatively impacted by it. This is a concrete bridge over 500 South. A lot of these earlier infrastructure upgrades over the river were done in a very, sort of Art Deco and very sort of beautiful way and form. Today, we're a little bit more utilitarian in nature. Unfortunately, I think that is something that I'm hoping comes back, that we have a little bit more attention to our bridges. But you start to see the vegetation that has cropped up around the river with the trees and the landscaping as people have filled in the subdivisions over the year. This is, I think, around 100 south, just a bridge. You're starting to show the failure of the bridge itself. They're putting sandbags, it's starting to sag, but you also see the debris backing up underneath the bridge itself and impacting the flow of the river. So this is an image of a bridge that's sort of a combination. You can still see some of that old concrete that's a little bit more decorative in nature. The White Bridge, North Temple, I think this is one of the big sort of success stories of early infrastructure for Salt Lake City. They constructed this over the river at North Temple, just to the west of where the Fair Park is. I love this image just because you see the little kids, they're hanging off the side of the bridge there on the right side. So this was very popular, but you can see just the engineering approach was utilizing the resources that they have on hand at the time, so a lot of wood, but getting it over the river. By the 30s, they had upgraded to a concrete structure. You can see the Fair Park buildings had been developed by this time. But just the natural landscape in and around the river still gives it sort of a beauty, even though it had gone through sort of some impacts from negative, from sewer and sort of dumping grounds. This is North Temple today, not as great of a view of the river, but it's seen as a resource for the community that's surrounding it, and this is one of the last stretches of the Jordan Parkway that they're working to connect, is this North Temple to 200 South stretch. But they're working to get that infrastructure in place with some funding. 700 South, this is a rapid transit bridge. You can see the old streetcar that's coming across as Salt Lake City started to spread out and settle on the west side. The streetcars were able to take people over there and utilize the bridges that were in place from the streetcars, but also the railroads. And this is just looking in the same area today. You can see that the area is still very residential in nature along the river for the most part in some of these neighborhoods, which is great. This is also over on the west side of the river. I think it's either 10th or 11th west. Just looking to the west, some homes, and you can see the individual structures are lined up pretty close to the banks of the river, and some of those outbuildings are right up on the river itself. I think in the early days of electricity, they actually utilized the river and water as a source of hydroelectric power to help fund or facilitate the power and the electricity of Salt Lake City in the early days. This is looking towards that same area. Some of the buildings have been replaced instead of homes. There's a church on that same corner. You can tell that the bridge needs a little bit of attention. Looking at 400 South, just again, those old wood bridges going over the river, the natural landscape. In this one, you look at the bridge, it's been changed, but you start to see the Jordan River Parkway and its proximity to the river so that people can enjoy being adjacent to it. Down at 700 South, looking at the Surplus Canal, the bridges that went over it for transit and railroad. Some of the western side, closer to the Surplus Canal, was a little bit more industrial in nature. You had some early factories, and it's still kind of that way today. This is looking up at that same bridge up on the left side. This is Redwood Road. If you can believe it, that's Redwood Road crossing the river on that bridge. Very different than the Redwood Road today, which is very wide and sort of suburban and industrial in nature. Going farther south down by the Jordan Narrows, the early dams that were constructed to facilitate those canals and the irrigation for farming, putting in at the Narrows to do the diversions at an elevation point that was high enough to let the river flow by gravity into those canals to utilize farther out into the valley. Looking down at that dam in the Jordan Narrows today, I think there's 6 different major diversion structures right there at the Narrows that carry out those major canals. This is them building the dam. You can't quite see it very well in this image, but there's people on boats in the river, but then it was a very utilitarian nature. If you're boating in the river, it was because you were building a dam or you're putting in a water wheel, not necessarily because you're out there boating for fun with your family. Just looking down, it's the same Jordan River and the Narrows today with the dam. I think this is a great panoramic view that I found on Bluffdale's website. Because it shows that even though a lot of the area, especially in Salt Lake County, has been very urbanized and subdivided, a lot of residential, that there's still areas farther south along the river that have sort of that rural open landscape. And I think there's more effort to try to instill buffers for development along the river with riparian corridor overlays to keep the development from encroaching quite so close to the river and keeping it open. I mentioned the hydroelectric power today. This is an image of the Jordan River Parkway down there in Bluffdale, and just like that there's the wind power in the background. So we're still kind of utilizing nature as a resource in different ways. And that is all. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you, Susie. It seems like I do live very close to the river. I'm a Rose Park resident, and it's surprising. I grew up in the Avenues and then became a. Jessica, where's your? That one? Okay. There we go. All right. I grew up as an Avenues kid, and it's interesting how actually the development pattern down in Rose Park, there is some orientation toward the river on a lot of the properties that adjoin now. Our final speaker today is Jessica Montcalm. Jessica is speaking today about another mining town, Sego, as a case study in identifying an industrial landscape. Jessica works for the Utah Division of Oil, Gas, and Mining as a project manager and is staff archaeologist with the Abandoned Mine Reclamation Program. She also provides archaeological coordination and review support to the oil, gas, minerals, and coal groups within the division.
Thank you, everyone, for lasting this long in the day. We try to keep everybody awake and through to the end. Yes, I am with the Division of Oil, Gas, and Mining, and contrary to the beliefs of some, we don't just destroy history. Sometimes we work actively to preserve things and forward what we can find out. We do that all the time, as much as we possibly can. For this presentation, Sego has become one of our little pet projects in the division, both as a means of sort of going back to address some of the past work that we've done, and as a means of looking at our future projects and being able to approach them in a way that is more sympathetic to the historic landscape and fabric of these small mining communities that we work in. So, just for a little locational information, as many may know, Sego is located north of Thompson Springs, which is located northeast-ish of Moab. Sego proper is 8 miles off of the interstate, I-70, out of Thompson Springs. I gave this presentation earlier this week up in Bozeman, Montana, and it dawned on me that it might have been nice to have a larger map for the state of Utah because not everybody knows where I-70 runs. So I trust folks here know where I-70 is. In this map, you can see some of our preliminary planning. We've identified the location of the Sego mine, Sego itself. I'm sure folks are familiar with the petroglyphs associated with Sego. Most folks that I've spoken with who hear Sego think petroglyphs. They don't think coal mine that was active for almost 50 years up a canyon. And And then looking a little more closely at that canyon, we have what we defined as our project boundaries for our 2014 project. Now, as I mentioned, the Division of Oil, Gas, and Mining Abandoned Mine Reclamation Program did do reclamation at the Sego Canyon mines in the late 80s and early 1990s. At that time, our efforts were focused on closing off access to the portals that were left over from the mining operations and cleaning up the structural elements left from the mine itself. The tipple was still there, it was mostly burned, badly deteriorating, and it was posing a physical hazard to folks who were recreating up in the canyon, so that came down. Then we stepped back, focused our efforts on other parts of the state, and came back in 2012 during a statewide re-inventory of coal closure projects that we had conducted, and identified some additional areas in Sego Canyon for cleanup. We checked on the competency of the closures and the portals that we had conducted in the late 80s, early 90s, and worked to clean up some of the coal waste that had been left sitting out and was at this time slowly washing down into the ephemeral creek that runs down the bottom of the canyon. Going further back, the original developments at Sego sort of grew out of the scouting and enterprising efforts of a gentleman by the name of Henry Ballard. This is not a picture of good old Mr. Ballard. That comes later. He, for all intents and purposes, built and operated Thompson Springs. He was majority owner of the infrastructure in Thompson, such as it was in the early 1900s, and he ran his cattle operation, grazing and livestock activities up both Thompson Canyon and Sego Canyon. It was up those canyons that he noticed that there was a pretty looking coal outcrop, and he had a brilliant idea to start hauling out coal from one of the seams, loading it into the back of the wagon, and driving the wagon the 8 miles back down to Thompson to start marketing it to the rural communities of the region. The picture, not of the gentleman in the coal seam, is a photo taken in about 1909 by the USGS inventory crew, one of whom is the gentleman in the coal seam, when they made their first run through the Sego area documenting the geology of Granite County. The picture of the infrastructure at the mine is representative of Ballard's early efforts. It was a mom and pop shop. He had a rough timber tipple, that was his tipple. He loaded the coal from the seam down the chute into the wagons. In about 1910, 1911, Ballard and a handful of his closest friends and financial backers who happen to live in Salt Lake City had the brilliant idea of investing a little more money into the coal camp and coming up with a really great venture to get this new kid in town, the Denver Rio Grande and Western, to purchase their coal. The Denver Rio Grande and Western had at that time completed their track up from Grand Junction to Price. Thompson was situated conveniently along that track, and Ballard and his crew saw a great way to make extra money from their coal operations by selling that coal directly to a steady consumer, that being the railroad to power their locomotives. The organization of this happened in a way that also coincided with them selling the idea to the Denver Rio Grande and Western that we'll get you guys the coal for a great contract price if you guys can help us build the track. So the Ballard and Thompson Railroad was incorporated and constructed, connecting the mine at Sego with Thompson down at the canyon so they could sell off their coal to the Denver Rio Grande and Western. The same time period saw an increase in infrastructure at the mine proper. This picture, we can see the sorts of investments that were made by that influx of capital. We've got a new tipple and wash facility that are much more engineered, shall we say, than the last round of tipple. We've got a barn for maintenance and the upkeep of animals and additional things at the camp. We've got boarding houses and wash house. And if we turn around and look north up the canyon from that same photo spot, we'll see the extent of some of the, shall we say, ethnic settlements associated with Sego. Now, I titled this Upper Camp because Sego, much like many other coal camps and mining camps of the area, was racially segregated. The managerial staff, the Euro-American, native English-speaking folks lived in an area that was most commonly referred to as Lower Camp, which was removed from the industrial core of the mine operations, whereas the majority of the non-English speaking, non-native employees of the camp lived closer to the industrial core, closer to where they could be to work immediately, and they termed that as Upper Camp. In the 20s, the American Fuel Company was encountering some financial difficulties. There were small problems like labor strikes going on throughout the region. These also impacted Sego. The American Fuel Company had a habit, much like many other operator, of saying, oh, well, we don't exactly have enough money to pay you guys right now, so how about we push it off to next week and pay you what we owe you then? Or they would pay in script that the employees could use at the company store. Or if an immigrant group decided to bring in so-and-so's cousin from up in Price, who happened to be a labor organizer who was going to try and work with the employees to band folks together to fight for the payment they deserved, they were blacklisted. So this is a common theme throughout any mining camp you can encounter in the East and the West, and Sego was not immune. That rolled over into a filing for bankruptcy, which in turn led to a sale of the company to the Chesterfield Fuel Company, who was based out of Rhode Island, but interestingly had the same board members as the American Fuel Company. The, again, common practice in the organization of businesses at the time, one might argue today. Along with the sale to Chesterfield, however, came a renewed sinking of funds into the infrastructure of the mine. The Chesterfield Company installed water tanks and a new and improved wash facility, which at the time was touted as being the best and the only one of its type west of the Mississippi at that time. They ran an electrical line from the substation down in Thompson, set up a sub in Sego, and did away with using animals in the mine and ran everything operation-wise underground electrically. They also brought in more employees. If you look closely, I don't have a clicker, but along the railroad tracks here, you can see an indication of some standard worker housing in the Upper Camp area. We've been referring to these as dugouts. In mine maps that have been turned up recently, these are called out as actual cabins. So there is some discrepancy between what we may think of a cabin today versus what was defined as a cabin in the mine camp. Here we have a picture of the new and improved tipple built during the Chesterfield years next to the tipple that was built by the American Fuel Company, which they operated. The tipple on, that would be your left-hand side of the screen, is the one that lasted until its final until its final tear down in the 1980s. The background behind all of this is sort of to try and flesh out a more detailed story of Sego, because during the course of the compliance work with the town, for the purposes of adhering to state rules as well as federal rules, the majority of what was done was a baseline archaeological inventory without necessarily a lot of contextual development, because it wasn't necessarily required to have a very detailed look to say that there was a lot of things here that were potentially very important. And we also identified very early on that the construction that the abandoned mine reclamation program would be doing was going to be focused not necessarily on the areas that retain a lot of important information, but in areas a little removed from those important things. So that was sidetracked for a little while. until it was pointed out to the program that our cumulative actions at the site really did adversely affect a portion of the historic site. So that sort of shifted focus to try and flesh out this context of Sego as a place. And this is where we went from doing a simple on-the-ground review to really digging into the historical records available to us. And this is where the actual meaty story of Sego starts to build. Through the newspaper accounts that came out in Grand County at that time, we find out that Sego was actually second in the county behind only Moab when it came to backing Liberty Bond drives during World War I. They sent their children to World War I. The sons and daughters of Sego were impacted by the Spanish flu that was occurring roughly at the same time as World War I. This tiny community of approximately 500 people at its peak, 200 of which worked in the mines, had these national and international ties to these trends and events that were occurring outside of their little canyon. I alluded to it previously, but Sego was not immune to labor activities. There was a very active Greek and Italian community within Sego, and they in turn had their ties to labor organizers in the Price Helper area who, according to newspaper accounts, came down numerous times to work with the employees at Sego to sort of develop their own impetus to organize. The miners in Sego also did take part in national labor strikes, even though their level of effort was a lot quieter because none of them wanted to lose their jobs. This was all that they had. The most, at least for me, entertaining thing in the newspaper accounts, besides the baseball rivalry that existed between Moab and Sego, which, let me tell you what, you want to read about some animosity between two towns, start reading about baseball games. They're fantastic. But one of the wells of identifying how many different ethnic groups were actually in this little camp has been to go through the newspaper accounts that deal with bootlegging and prohibition. Sego, I swear, has everyone in town who was anyone was written up at some point in time, was fined, was arrested, or had something confiscated. And it doesn't matter if it was Mrs. Ronzio, who was an upstanding figure in the community, who ran not only the dairy but also the cafe down the way, or nameless immigrants from Austria. Well, he's not nameless, but take your pick of whoever it was. They were running into these little snafus, shall we say, with the local sheriff. And at a certain point, it reads almost as if it's a game among the community members to see who can get away with what, or who's going to take the brunt this week so everybody else can sort of slip under the cracks. Along with the portrayals of the Grand County newspaper, we have newspaper accounts that are being printed up in Salt Lake City where the financial backers of the mine lived. And it's interesting to look at the dichotomy between what's being printed locally versus what's being printed in an area where the financial backers are. The newspaper accounts that are published in Salt Lake City don't necessarily speak to the actual goings-on in the camp. They paint a very rosy picture, a picture of a mine that pays its employees promptly, suffers from no labor unrest, and is all-American. If we, with our little bit of hindsight, look back at it and see all-American to mean a rich tapestry of many immigrants coming together working towards a single goal, yes, it was very much an all-American camp. If we look at it from the perspective that was being touted by the backers in Salt Lake City of your staff really supports the upper-level mine management and all of the financial decisions that they are making because they are very happy with what they're doing, it's not necessarily that way. Sego is known as one of the busiest coal camps in the state, even though it was relatively small compared to the other camps, especially up in Carbon and Emery counties. And it also had a very limited source for, well, limited in some sense, for its product. It sold directly to the Rio Grande and Western. The Rio Grande and Western in turn marketed it elsewhere, but its main client was the Rio Grande and Western. That was It proved eventually to be Sego's downfall, but for a good 50 years, it made a successful run, had continued operations, and it's one of the longest lasting small communities associated with coal mining. Finally, the employees of Sego at the end of the lifespan of the mine, which coincided with the deregulation of diesel following World War II and the severing of that contract with the Denver, Rio Grande, and Western, turned around and did something that wasn't necessarily common anywhere in the state. They pooled their resources, they purchased the mine, they purchased the operational facilities, and they purchased the camp housing associated with Sego, and operated the mine under employee ownership for about 4 years before they finally threw in the towel because they weren't able to make enough selling to the local communities to provide the income that they need. This puts us at about 1952, which coincides with another new trend in the southeastern Utah region. I'm sure many of you may recognize a little name called uranium. With the arrival of the uranium boom, most everyone in Sego packed up and moved out and sought their fortunes elsewhere. Coal wasn't profitable anymore. There was nothing left for them in the camp. Kids weren't coming home. They left for the war. If they did come home, they were going over to Grand Junction. They were settling in Moab where the jobs were. They were out in Green River. They went up to Price. There was no reason for the camp, so they hauled it off. By 1956, operations in the camp ceased, and most of the structures were hauled out. If anyone notices the Thompson one-room schoolhouse that's on the road on the way up to Sego, that is actually the schoolhouse from Sego. It is not Thompson's original schoolhouse. It was moved down the hill during that dismantling period and set up, and now it's being used as a storage facility by the water users district down there. Sego, interestingly, is also reportedly one of the safest mines throughout this period in coal mining in Utah. In looking through the newspaper records, I have not found fatalities associated with Sego. People have gotten their heads knocked in by pieces of coal, but they don't die. People have broken